Language, Race, Religion, Epistemology, and Chicanismo. Language. The lands known today as Mexico contained most of the cultural complex called Mesoamerica, where the Aztec Empire and the Purépecha Empire and at least 6 other cultures carved out their own, often isolated kingdoms. Today, we have a record of around 68 indigenous languages still spoken in Mexico only. Many indigenous languages, cultures, and cosmovisions went into extinction along with the people that spoke them through warfare, disease, and acculturation. Of those 65 native nations that remain, each with their own language, represent about 10% of Mexico's population, about 12 million native people plus all of us mestizos, who many actually unknowingly also have indigenous blood. Spanish was taught with the sword and with the whip. Natives were tortured, their bodies displayed in pieces to warn the others never dare do anything other than was ordered to them. Others would see that and know that they had to assimilate to Spanish to survive. Many others committed suicide. Most died from diseases the Spanish brought with them. This because the Spanish waited years for natives to die off in order to weaken them before ever attacking them. In turn, the cronistas of the Spanish colonizers, or the journalists/historians of the time, who were in charge of taking down all the things that happened and in chronological order, took it upon themselves to write atrocities about the natives so as to justify their forced settlement and murder. Cronistas like Inés de Sepúlveda and Fernández de Oviedo wrote that the natives were, quote, of poor memory, lazy, melancholic, suicidal, inclined to wrongdoing, liars, vile, and cowardly, end quote. Such affirmations were justified by their claims that the natives did not have a culture, a history, nor a real language. To counter this, a Spanish friar, Bartolomé de las Casas, wrote amongst his most famous texts a short account of the destruction of the Indies in 1552 and Historia de las Indias from 1527 to 1559, chronicling the first decades of colonization of the West Indies. He described the atrocities committed by the colonizers against the indigenous peoples. One of his major arguments was that writers like Oviedo and Sepúlveda never lived amongst the natives, nor did they know the natives as people, but only enough to take advantage of them, steal from them, capture and enslave them in mines or other cruel work, killing them from hunger and exhaustion. Concerning language, he wrote, Oviedo cannot say such things because he was not worthy of seeing it nor understanding it. De las Casas records that native oral tradition, which the Spanish were too ignorant to try to learn and understand, was the format of the history of the indigenous Americans. They would tell their history, quote, of the past things, as of the wars, as of the peace treaties, end quote, employing words either by telling or by singing in such a way that they could remember it all and transmit it all in oral form. He also added that it seemed as if it was by nature that natives had an extraordinary capacity to take and tell their histories, a capacity that no other nations possess. In the unwillingness of the Spanish colonizer to acknowledge the language of the natives, we find the key to their dehumanization and the marginalization of their current, present, and past histories. Ask yourselves, how would things have been different for natives if their language was respected and accepted as present? How important is language? How important is it to be able to maintain your language? What about those of us who have lost 2 languages, an indigenous language and Spanish? Race. Imagine if people from Kansas and Florida were as genetically distinct from each other as someone from Germany is from someone from Japan. That's the kind of genetic variation that scientists from UCLA found in a genetic study they did within Mexico published in Science magazine titled The Genetics of Mexico Recapitulates Native American Substructure and Affects Biomedical Traits. This all relates back to the rich diversity of our indigenous American nations and to our own related ancestry. When the UCLA team analyzed the genomes of 511 indigenous individuals from all over Mexico, they found a striking amount of genetic diversity. The most divergent indigenous groups in Mexico are as different from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. Most people in Mexico or of Mexican descent these days do not claim to be indigenous, but rather mixed or mestizo, meaning they have a mixture of indigenous, European, and African ancestry. So, do you think all that local variation has been smoothed out by centuries of different groups mixing into mestizaje? Mexico's National Institute of Genomic Medicine, which has been collecting genetic data from mestizos for many years, found that mestizos in a given part of Mexico tended to have the same rare genetic variants as their indigenous neighbors. Dr. Pasaunik claims the mestizo genome is so close to the indigenous groups that we could use the genetic diversity in mestizos to make inferences about their native ancestors. Strong genetic markers of Maya ancestry, for example, show up in the genomes of modern people living in the Yucatan Peninsula and the northern part of Mexico's Gulf Coast in the modern state of Veracruz, which likely reflects a pre-Columbian Maya trade or migration route. Did we Mexicans simply forget our indigenous ties and or ancestral roots? No. What happened with language was because of the hierarchization of race, otherwise known as racism. Racism is dehumanization. Dehumanization is also the inability to accept that others have equally significant perspectives that need to be listened to, understood, and genuinely regarded as equally worthy of existing and proposing other institutional possibilities. Difference in race was used as a marker for dehumanization. What could make the genocide of natives possible if you could make it so that you could no longer tell one apart from the other by just looking at them? Difference was understood as the native being different or off from the norm, and the norm was the Spaniard. The American Indian phenotype was made to become the marker of an organic inferiority that made it okay to treat indigenous people as less than human, because why would someone with such defects not be? Yet, those were not actually the qualities of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Never did the Spaniard stop to think that he was different to the indigenous people, and that skin color would also become a marker to him. Many of the indigenous peoples of America and their descendants were forced to eventually internalize the sense of inferiority and later even begin projecting the same discourse to attempt to increase hierarchical status in society. It did not end with the imposition of language and white over indigenous. They also found themselves before a crazy conundrum. The rape of Native women and the continual subsequent mixing gave forth to what was in their limited and greedy perspective a new type of human, the mestizo. Could they somehow take advantage of this mixture, sometimes for the purposes of acquiring more privilege, and at other times could we use the same idea of mixture to further marginalize others? This is where the casta system finds a way to maintain status for those mestizos who were children of more powerful people and less for those who were children of the less powerful. This is why until this very day, two mestizos can have completely different and opposing life experiences. Mestizaje is such a broad term that it makes it possible to politicize the identity depending on what is most convenient to the players. The casta system not only created a hierarchical map of all the possible racial mixes, this map would mark where you landed socially and economically. The darker your skin, the lower your caste, the lighter the skin, you get it. The highest caste was Iberian white or Christian. And if your baptismal certificate was marked under that caste, you were in luck because you got great perks such as the right to exist as human, the right to pay lesser to no taxes, the right to be able to speak in public and be heard, the right to buy land, make business, have a job. Slowly, more and more people want to have basic human rights and want to have the ability to be given opportunities. So mixed people start longing to be whiter. They start acting more Spanish, embracing that side of their blood, or faking themselves to be it, adopting more of their ways, keeping a Spanish last name, etc. All these acts would point to the obvious fabrication that Spanish European everything was better than being anything else. This is an example of how oppression and marginalization becomes internalized, and this continues to happen even today. Without a doubt, the hierarchies that apply to race are also applied to the way other cultures, religions, and epistemologies are perceived and treated. Religion and epistemology. Religion and epistemology go hand in hand as part of the elements that make up what we call a culture. It was through religion that the Spanish cosmovision and knowledge system came to be propagated in the Americas. The university system was initially a system of colleges meant to educate Christian ministers and Catholic priests. This is how higher education came to be in both Mexico and the United States. Thus, epistemology of the Americas is highly Eurocentric. Epistemology refers to the theory of knowledge, especially regarding its methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. Epistemology justifies and helps us understand how native knowledge and why the history of the colonization of the Americas from the perspective of the natives was null in academia for many years. It was not until the late 1960s that people of color at universities have demanded that our knowledge is also validated and included in university curriculum. Until today, we keep having to fight the implementation of ethnic studies knowledge in schools and universities. This class is an example. I have had to fight to be able to continue offering it every semester. What is true is defined by the parameters of knowledge as propagated by science. What is beautiful is defined by aesthetics and propagated in art. What is good is defined by morals and propagated through religion. Ask yourselves, why is diversity of knowledge important? How do you think epistemology affects leadership, teaching, what we learn about, how we act and speak? What do you think have been the results of suppressing and limiting knowledge to the Eurocentric cosmovision and understanding of the properties of being such as truth, beauty, and goodness through science, art, and religion, respectively? We have learned how the mestizo identity comes to be in Mexico and how it is represented in murals, which were the alternative form of education for the masses who were denied access to institutions of knowledge. The plan was to keep them as a laboring class. In the United States, marginalization did not occur in quite the same way. Here, we have the introduction of Anglo culture and a Christian religion descendant of Puritanism. The English and Dutch did not tend to mix with the natives. They would rather kill them. The arrival of the Anglo in the Southwest brought with it the first U.S. border. Their presence and their attempt to take over the land as they had with the natives forced the establishment of the Mexican American as foreigner to their own land. This is the story of the other side, la del otro lado. This is where we meet Chicano. It does not matter if we read our history in pieces. It was literally made to be this way. This does not mean it's not valid. It means it has survived and been passed on with great efforts and love. What matters most is that we read our history, hear it, and honor it by providing support for those marginalized due to those episodes of our history that besides all odds you are now coming to know. As the U.S. expanded and took over the lands and natural resources belonging to Mexicans who were living in those same lands for hundreds of years before Anglo settlers reached them, a false propaganda campaign was ignited. Posters, postcards, dime novels, like comic books, and later on films depicted white settlers as victims of animalistic, cruel, stupid, and dirty indigenous people and Mexicans. Sounds like an echo of the Spanish settlers, huh? Who were actually only attempting to defend their lands and patrimony. We see this in the archetype of the bandido and the revolutionary, not depicted in their true complex historical context, but as a floating reckless example of an assumed organically inferior nature. This is the second phenomenon of coloniality from which Chicano identity arises, its genealogy. As found in the documentary Foreigners in Their Native Land, bandits came to be the earliest mass representation of Mexican American and Latino identity in the USA Anglo-dominant imaginary. But there were socioeconomic and political purposes fueling the ill representations. These included attempting to take over their lands, keep their homes and locales, as well as the natural resources. This is where we see the first examples of Chicano musical art and oral history being produced in El Corrido. I will discuss this further in the next segment. Chicanx history is U.S. history, bandits and El Corrido as foundations of the Chicana sensibility. Were bandidos really outlaws who were internally insane and wicked? Or were they poetic geniuses and brave heroes confronting and resisting the settler colonial beast?